Lytudiep. Hello, dear friends. Today, Diep meets James' mother for the first time. The first time Lytudiep stepped into the grand mansion of the Trin family. The ancestral home of CEO Trin James. She could feel the weight of silent judgment in the air. Every glance, every measured look from the house staff carried a subtle edge of curiosity, perhaps even disapproval. But no gaze was more piercing, more unforgettable than that of James' mother. In her eyes, Diep saw suspicion, caution, and a quiet but unmistakable sense of rejection. She didn't say much, just nodded briefly when James introduced her. But every word she spoke during that initial dinner was laced with unspoken meaning. She asked about Diep's background, her family, her work, and how she and James had met. Diep knew, though, that these weren't the polite inquiries of a future mother-in-law trying to get to know her son's partner. No, these were the questions of a woman weighing, evaluating, measuring her worth. Coming from a modest family with no wealth or power, Diep knew all too well that she wasn't what Mrs. Trin had envisioned for her only son. An heir to a massive business empire, a man burdened with legacy and expectations. But Diep didn't take offense. She understood. A mother who had sacrificed everything for her child's future, who had built a legacy with her own hands, had every right to be cautious. Instead of growing resentful, or trying to fight her way into the woman's heart, Diep chose silence. She chose patience. She chose to let time and sincerity speak for her. Every time she visited James' home, she quietly offered to help with chores, preparing meals with the cooks, tidying the tea set, or joining Mrs. Trin in the garden to trim flowers or arrange the living room. She didn't do these things to earn approval. She did them because they were natural to her, because she believed that sincerity, like sunlight, could eventually seep through even the thickest walls. James, of course, was aware of his mother's discerning nature, but he had never seen her so visibly guarded toward any of his past girlfriends. Still, he stood by Diep, firm and unwavering. Diep, for her part, never asked him to choose between her and his mother. She knew that love wasn't a battle to be won. It was a journey to be shared, with respect for every heart involved. One rainy morning, Diep stopped by to drop off some forgotten documents for James. She found Mrs. Trin alone in the garden, flustered, trying to salvage a rare orchid whose stem had snapped. The staff had gone to the market. And the elderly woman was struggling to fix the damage. Without hesitation, Diep gently offered to help, drawing on techniques she'd learned from her father. A former gardener, she carefully trimmed and grafted the orchid, stabilizing its base and restoring the plant. Mrs. Trin didn't say much. But she didn't stop her either. From that day forward, whenever something in the garden needed tending, it was always Diep whom she happened to ask. Then, one evening when Mrs. Trin came down with a cold, Diep prepared a pot of warm porridge with ginger, goji berries, and bird's nest. Something her own mother used to cook for her when she was sick. She brought it over quietly, along with a flask of herbal tea. Mrs. Trin looked surprised. Then simply said, "At least you know how to take care of people." It was a small sentence, yet to Diep, it was the first ray of light through long-shadowed clouds. Over time, the atmosphere began to shift. Mrs. Trin still kept her distance, still carried herself with a noble composure. But she no longer looked at Diep as if she didn't belong. Sometimes, when James was away on business, she would even invite Diep to dinner. On one such evening, she began to share stories from her youth, how she and her late husband built the company from the ground up, the sacrifices she had made. And the weight of raising a son under the immense expectations of legacy. Diep listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. She didn't try to argue or impress. She simply sat there, present, open, and understanding. She didn't need to prove she was worthy of James. She just had to be true to herself, to love him fully, and to treat his mother with the respect she deserved. The day Mrs. Trin looked at James and said, "I think Diep is a thoughtful girl with a kind heart," was the day he almost thought he misheard her. But Diep knew. She saw it in her eyes, that subtle warmth, that gentle shift in tone. From the wary glances of their first meeting to the tenderness she saw now, Diep understood something important. Trust isn't granted with pretty words. It's earned with time, with honesty, with the courage to keep showing up even when you're doubted. And then, one afternoon, as the three of them sat sipping tea under the magnolia trees in the back garden, Mrs. Trin turned to James and softly said, "I used to think only women from noble families could stand beside you. But now I realize that true nobility lies not in status, but in the way someone lives and loves." James smiled, reaching for Diep's hand. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet joy of finally being seen. She had spent months walking a path filled with silent trials, and now, at last, she was home. Not just in James' arms, but in the heart of his family. From that moment forward, the bond among them only grew stronger. During festivals, Diep stood beside Mrs. Trin, preparing offerings for the ancestors. When James faced stress at work, it was often his mother who called Diep first, trusting her to calm and support him. At a formal family event, in front of cousins, uncles, and business partners, it was Mrs. Trin who introduced Diep as my future daughter-in-law. It was a moment Diep had never dared dream of in those early, uncertain days. Life she realized, doesn't always require grand gestures to change direction. Sometimes the smallest things, a bowl of warm porridge, a rescued orchid, a patient smile, can open the hardest hearts. To Diep, the journey from doubt to trust wasn't a miracle. It was the natural result of a love big enough to endure, a heart steady enough to wait. And a belief that as long as she remained true, the truth would one day shine through. One afternoon, as they sat together once more in the garden, sipping jasmine tea and enjoying the golden quiet of dusk, Mrs. Trin turned to her and said, "You don't have to be perfect, child. You just have to keep your heart kind. That alone is enough for people to believe in you." Diep smiled, tears glistening again, not from weakness but from gratitude. She had passed through a long door. Not just the door to a wealthy family or a prestigious life. No, she had stepped through the true threshold of acceptance. A door carved from respect, softened by time, and opened by the beginning of faith.